Good day everyone, we are the Group A. Today, we will discuss about history and philosophy of movement education. And here's our topic's objectives. First, to learn and perceive about history and philosophy of movement education. Second, to introduce movement education. And lastly, to identify creators and their contributions in movement education.
Good day everyone, we are the Group A. We will discuss the history and philosophy of movement education. I am Jessamine Abrogenia and I will be the first to discuss about the history of movement education and also with Arnado Michel. What is movement education? Movement education is a form of teaching which aims to educate and aid in the development of students' motor skills through physical movement. To developing a wide base so that students develop skills in executing many types of movement. One of our job as education is to help children develop positive attitudes towards a healthy lifestyle. In the history of movement education, in 80s occurred in the field of dance, became known as a movement education until 1960s, 1970s, and into 1980s. From 1960s to 1980s, it found way into physical education and other exercise classes.
Movement education began as part of dance education in the 1800s, but found its way into physical education and other exercise classes from the 1960s to 1980s. While it's considered to be under the umbrella of physical education in schools, movement education really strives to go further. The early pioneers of movement education were influenced by the idea of body being an expression of movement.
The philosophy that makes movement education different. All physical educators want to provide lessons that foster success. The MEF or Movement Education Framework, however, focuses on not only fostering motor success but also developing cognitive knowledge about movement. Movement education is about developing a very wide base so that students develop skill in executing many types of movement. To establish this wide base, the movement education approach uses a specific framework for classifying movements and encourages learners to build a movement vocabulary that they can apply to all subsequent movement content. So, which means philosophy of movement education, all physical educators or teachers will help to provide lessons to their students or learners nga ma-develop pa gyud ilang skills in executing different types of movement, particularly in elementary level.
Hi, good day everyone. This is me, Franz Abinido, with my partner, Bernie Baganaw. So at this part, we are going to identify the creators of movement education. The early pioneers of movement education were influenced by the idea of the body being an expression of movement. Three of the most historically influential individuals were Francis Del Sarte, Slot Diem, and Rodolph von Neumann. So, Bernie Bagana will introduce you who Francis.
So one of the first people to articulate ideas of motion was Francois Alexandre Nicolas Thierry Del Sarte, a Frenchman who lived in the 19th century. So this era was influenced by Romanticism, which emphasized the notion of expression of thought and emotion. So Del Sarte suggested that the combination of movements towards and away from the center of the body was critical to all other movements.
Next on the list is Slot Diem. In the mid to late 1930s, Professor Slot Diem and her husband Karl founded an internationally known college in Germany to train teachers in sport and in physical education. The college taught a natural approach to teaching children to move effectively in all kinds of situations. Children were encouraged to explore movement freely in their own way and according to their unique stages of development. Games approach centered on learning to build movement, skills, and balance. Teachers were encouraged to challenge children by asking questions such as, who can do this and how can this be done differently? Then they would be then guided the children toward improving their quality of movement.
Rudolf von Laban is considered by most as true pioneer of movement education. So his critical contribution was his theory of movement, which specifically focusing on the effort. Functional movement has a purpose in addition to helping with the task of everyday life, which is functional movement. So the four factors of movement which Laban identified was weight, space, time, and flow became the bedrock of what became known as movement education.
Good day, I am Joyce Arabalangig. So my topic for today is all about one of the contributor of the creators to the field of movement education. So Lieselot Thiem, she was a German university teacher from Germany. In the mid to late 1930s, Professor Lieselot Thiem and her husband Karl founded an internationally known college in Germany, called Deutsches Sportschule. Is a sport university college in Germany, the Germany's largest and most prestigious center of teaching and research in physical education and sport science. And the purpose is to train teachers in sport and physical education. So according to Brown and Summer, the college taught a natural approach to teaching children to move effectively in all kinds of situations. It means that children encouraged to explore movement freely in their own way and according to their unique stages of development, and we will know that we can easily learn by doing. The teacher's role was to provide an environment that supported and fostered this focus. So the teacher's role was to providing an environment coordinates that would encourage or support the children to explore movement freely in their own way. The teacher would use equipment such as balls, wands, ropes, boxes, and benches to allow children to develop a wide variety of movement responses individually, with partners, or in a small group. For example, in balls, balloon, or bola, something ball or circle. As you can observe, children can move freely in their own way. Like wands, like mag-magic, mag bilang body, or in the arms. Ropes, like mag-jumping sila, or magbira-bira. Boxes, benches, mag-ambag sila, or mag-move sila sa lahing place using balance. So Thiem's approach centered on learning to build movement skills and balance. So teachers were encouraged to challenge children by asking questions such as who can do this and how can this be done differently. They would then guide the children toward improving their quality of movements. Thiem's focus for older children was more on developing an awareness and analysis of muscular force as well as how to move in time and space. That's all. I hope you learned something.
Rudolf von Laban. He was born on December 15, 1879 at Bratislava, Austria-Hungary, now in Slovakia, and died on July 1, 1958 at Weybridge, Surrey, England at the age of 78. He was considered by most as the true pioneer of movement education. He also has a critical contribution called Theory of Movement, which focusing is physically on the concept of effort, and he believed that the body was an instrument of expression. Rudolf made a distinction between expressive movement and functional movement. Expressive movement communicates ideas in dance or other forms of artistic expression. Functional movement, movements that serve as a purpose in everyday life, such as sports and games. He also identified 4 factors of movement, namely weight, space, time, and flow, and it has become the bedrock of education. Rudolf von Laban was a dancer, a choreographer, and a dance or movement theoretician, one of the founders of European modern dance. His works was extended through his most celebrated collaborators, Mary Wigman, Kurt Jooss, and Sigurd Lieder. Through his work, Laban raised the status of dance as an art form and his explorations into the theory and practice of dance and movement transformed the nature of dance scholarship. He also established choreology, the discipline of dance analysis, and invented a system of dance notation, now known as Laban notation or kinetography Laban. Laban was the first person to develop community dance, and he has set out to reform the role of dance education, emphasizing his belief that dance should be made available to everyone.
So hello, the last creator who has a contribution in the field of movement education is François Delsarte. So François Delsarte is one of the first people to articulate ideas of movement. He is a Frenchman, a performer, and a teacher of voice and movement. So in the next slide, these are the contribution of François Delsarte in the field of movement education. So the first one is he developed a system known as Delsarte method, in which performers were taught to develop the expressiveness of their bodies. The second one is he developed what he termed applied aesthetical. Delsarte created his applied aesthetics as a modern scientific method of artists, particularly performers, to investigate the nature of human being. The third contribution of François Delsarte is he contributed critical ideas of connections among the mind, body, and spirit. He also saw movement as a union of time, space, and motion. Delsarte suggested that the combination of movements toward and away from the center of the body was critical to all movements. He believed that expressive movements should relate to the emotion that inspired that movement. Another contribution of Delsarte is that he introduced the idea of parallelism in movement, that is, the simultaneous motion of two body parts in the same direction and succession. François Delsarte also developed his own principles of physics. This was called as the 9 laws of motion. These are the altitude, force, motion, sequence, direction, form, reaction, velocity, and extension. Delsarte believed that these principles can empower your own communication as well as enrich your work in music, dance, theater, and any other depiction of movement art. His ideas of motion gave rise to much of what was to come in the field of movement education.
This is the summary of our report with the topic History and Philosophy of Movement Education. Movement education began as part of dance education in the 1800s, but found its way into physical education in 1960s to 1980s. Early pioneers of movement education were influenced by the idea of body being an expression of movement. Movement education framework focuses not only fostering motor success, but also developing cognitive knowledge about movement. And there are three most historically influential individuals. This is Francis Delsarte, Lieselot Diem, Rodolphe von Laban. Francis Delsarte, one of the first people to articulate ideas of movement, emphasized the notion of expression of thought and emotion, also saw movement as union of time, space, and motion. He contributed critical ideas of connections among the mind, body, and spirit. He developed his own principles of physics. This was called the 9 laws of motion. The second person is Lieselot Diem. Diem, together with her husband Karl, found an internationally known college in Germany to train teachers in sports and physical education. According to Lieselot, the teacher's responsibility is to offer an environment in which children can freely explore movement in their own way. The third one is Rodolphe von Laban, considered by most as true pioneer of movement education. His critical contribution was his theory of movement, which is focusing specifically on the concept of effort. He believed that the body was an instrument of expression. He made a distinction between expressive movement and functional movement. He also identified 4 factors of movement, which is weight, space, time, and flow. The early pioneers of movement education, Francis Delsarte, Liselott Dim, and Rudolf von Laban, helped push the importance of movement education in physical education. What they all had in common was this idea that the body was an instrument being an expression, and the way it is expressing is through movement.